Sleep last night?
Yes.
If you didn't, no worries, because I decided to wear the shirt that will keep you awake. And it's caffeine free. Today what we're going to be talking about is congregations as family systems. Again, part of what you already know about me is this is what I teach at Fuller. Most of my students are planning to be family therapists. And so right out of the gate, we need to help them start thinking in a different way. Everybody comes in with their own understandings of why people do what they do and how you can explain this person's behavior and that person's behavior. And a lot of times the way that we do that is by recourse to some kind of individual explanation. Oh, it's about that person's character. It's about that person's personality and so on. And that can be true sometimes. But when you're studying to be a marital and family therapist, one of the things that you need to start getting used to is the idea that sometimes what you're seeing when a couple walks in, a family walks in, is not, as they might say, oh, you know what the problem is? The problem is my wife, she's like this. You know what the problem is? The problem is my husband, he's like this. And doctor, if you would just fix him, if you would just fix her, then everything would be fine. But rather what we're talking about is two people, each of whom have their own issues, but it's the way that they relate to each other that needs to be changed. And if you could change the way that they relate to each other, then all the other personality issues, they don't go away, but they become unimportant to what it is that they're trying to accomplish when they come in therapy, right? That's what a systems way of thinking is all about. And what I want to suggest to you today, in both part 1 and part 2, is that some of these ways of thinking might actually help you think differently about what happens in your congregation. Now, I tangled out some bait there yesterday by mentioning the Warriors twice, and nobody took the bait. Okay, so I'm going to just go ahead and put that out there anyway. I'm a basketball fan, and I'm from Oakland. Can I get an amen for this one? And for a very long time, you know, the Bay Area hasn't had much to root for in basketball, and suddenly we do. And as a matter of fact, if you don't already know it, Stephen Curry is himself a quite devout Christian. He has a tattoo, I think it's on the inside of his right wrist, in Hebrew. What's the translation anyway? It's about God. And he's apparently somebody of quite good character. Everybody knows him as being a real straightforward kind of guy. He doesn't have the star complex and so on. He treats everyone in the organization the same way and so on. Okay? It's not about Steph Curry. But I'll tell you something that was very interesting to me in the playoffs so far. Here's the way that we typically think of things often in sports, right? I don't know who it is that keeps track of all these statistics. You know, how do they know these things? You know, the Warriors have just broken another record. Steph Curry is just, you know, the most consecutive threes in a game shot off your left foot on a Tuesday. Who knows all of those things? Somehow they were able to keep track of that, and there are all these records being set. By the end of the season, you've got a team that's won more games in the season than any other team ever has. And the way that we're going to tend to think about that is they're just going to march through the playoffs and beat everybody, right? And then they meet Oklahoma. And all the predictions about, well, who saw that coming? Who knew that it was going to go to 7 games? Who knew that it was not only going to go to 7 games, but it was going to go down to the last 5 minutes of Game 7 as to who was going to move on to the finals? And what that reminds me of is it's all about matchups. It's not just about saying, okay, so here is an individual player who is so dominant, he's just going to run over everybody else. Here is a team that is so dominant that they're just going to run over everyone else, because you never know what's going to happen when you put two teams together in a 7-game matchup, because suddenly the game changes, right? This is what I want us to start thinking about when you're thinking about people. You have individual characteristics, and to some extent, it's true. You know, if you're a guy like Steph Curry or Klay Thompson, you can shoot the ball from just about anywhere. You don't need a lot of space to do that, and you can be very successful at that. And there are going to be a lot of people who will have trouble stopping you from doing that. But that doesn't mean that everyone will, and it depends on who you're in the room with. It's the matchups that matter, and really what it comes down to when you get to the finals and you get to the playoffs is it's how do people match up with each other, not just who's more dominant. Okay? Now the same thing is going to be true in our relationships. We have to ask the question, how do we match up with each other? Because one person can be one way in one room with one person, right, in one relationship. You hear it on the news all the time. I can't understand how it was that this person did that. You know, every time somebody goes off on a rampage and shoots someone, you know, you interview people. We don't get it. We don't understand how that could possibly be. He was such a nice guy. Never gave anybody any trouble, right? You can be one way in one circumstance, and then when you put that person in another room with other people, things change. And it's not just because of the person's personality. It's something about the way that that interaction happens. And unless you're thinking that way, it's hard to track what that might actually be. And we go back to thinking about personality. You know, the nice thing about thinking about it in terms of personality is you can always use that to blame the other person. You know why we're having trouble? It's because you need to change. And if you would just change, we wouldn't have that trouble. But people who learn to think in terms of relationships have to say, okay, what is it that I am doing that is helping to keep the problem going? Does that mean that there's something wrong with me? No, not necessarily. If there is, but not necessarily. What am I doing that's keeping this pattern going? That's why we need to think in terms of relationships, and what I'm suggesting to you is this is the way that we need to start thinking about congregations, because congregations are about relationships. I'm going to give you a little bit of history with respect to family therapy so you can get this sense of what a systems perspective is all about, and then by the end of our session today, I'm going to focus it in very specifically on applying a systems way of thinking to congregations and start to play it out a little bit so that you have something to talk about. I'm going to change things up a little bit. You'll see in your outline that in the middle of the session there is a discussion question in there. What I'm going to do is we're going to use that discussion question. Instead of having a question, we'll take a break at that point, and then I'll leave more time at the end of the session for there to be both some discussion and some Q&A and interaction. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep on pace here. When we think about the beginnings of what was known as a family systems approach, it started with people who were being dissatisfied already with the more individualistic ways of thinking. Individualistic ways of thinking about problems, pathology, individualistic ways of thinking about treatment. A lot of people still have the stereotype that says, okay, so if somebody's going to go into psychotherapy, what happens is you find the problematic individual, you send them into one-on-one therapy with a therapist, they get fixed. And then they go back to their relationships and everything is going to be better. And early on, people were realizing, you know what, that's not really working. Okay? In many cases, this isn't working. This was particularly true with people who were working with children. And you may be familiar with situations like this. A kid goes off the rails, gets into trouble, and they get referred for treatment, and they get into treatment, and they start to do better, right? They seem to be developing more skills, they have a better attitude about things, and so on. They say, fine, great. Sometimes they even get institutionalized, right? And you're working with them, and everybody's saying, okay, this kid, they're fixing out their hole. And you stick them back in their family, and suddenly they go off the rails again. And people begin thinking, well, maybe it's not just the kid. Maybe it's something about what's happening at home that explains why it is that this kid went off the rails. And it was a rather radical suggestion at that point to think, what would it mean to have the entire family in treatment? What would that actually look like? It was politically incorrect to even think that way. You had to be something of a renegade to want to have a whole family in treatment. Or the various theories of schizophrenia. that were floating around in the 1950s and before, where people were thinking of that as primarily an individual pathology. We know more about schizophrenia these days in terms of brain-based explanations for why that happens. But back in the 1950s, people were beginning to discover that there were some folks who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, who had been hospitalized, that if you were to take a closer look at their family patterns, some of that could be explained by the way that the family interacted. In some cases, it was because children were growing up in a home that was constantly divided between the mother and the father. They were constantly battling with each other and always asking the kid to take sides. You know? And telling the other child, telling the child, let me tell you about your father, or let me tell you about your mother, that kind of thing. And so they grew up with that kind of existence. And sometimes it was because they were crazy making patterns of communication in the family. They would do things like communicate one message verbally with their mouth and communicate another message with their behavior. And you probably are all aware of the fact that more of the meaning of the communication gets communicated by our body language than by our words. And if you see a contradiction between those two things, it's usually the body language that you pay attention to, because people have less conscious control over that. So if I stand in front of you and I say something like this, I am just really delighted to be here at this retreat with you. Okay? What are you going to pay attention to, my words or my body language? Right? So kids were growing up in families in which you get contradictory messages that were being communicated at those two different levels, and they didn't know what to make out of that. It didn't make sense to them, but there was a rule in the family that said, don't you dare say anything about that. Because the child could not say to the parent, now hang on a second, okay? You're telling me this with your words and you're telling me this with your body language, and they both can't be true at the same time, so which is it? The child growing up in that family doesn't have the freedom to do that. They know that they're going to be punished if they do, and so the only recourse that they have is to retreat into a fantasy world, right? That was another of the explanations that were out there. Upshot being that even the kinds of problems that some people consider to be the most individual in nature could sometimes be traced back to patterns of relationship in the family that needed to be fixed. Okay? Now at that point, people are beginning to look for new ways of doing things, and people are experimenting with new ways of doing things. It's always amusing to me how some of these changes happen, because there are people who just experiment with new methods of therapy, and sometimes they do that because of a misunderstanding. There was one person, for example, working in a particular center in which everyone did individual therapy. That's what you were supposed to do. They were working out of a psychoanalytic perspective, and there was a rule about how you did therapy. You didn't bring different members of the family into therapy. Not only did you not work with couples and not work with whole families, you didn't work with members of the same family, even if they came in separately. You would have to refer them to another analyst, right? That was the way people practiced. And one therapist, you had two people at a dinner party. It's one of these dinner party jokes, right? You have a therapist there who's talking about another therapist that works in their center and saying, so-and-so's been actually experimenting with seeing members of the same family. And what he meant was he was breaking the rule about seeing family members separately. So he would see one family member today and he'd see a different family member tomorrow. And that was the experiment. And so this other therapist heard that and said, wow, what an intriguing idea. That guy's got such a reputation. I'm going to try that. And he brought the whole family in. And created a new way of working from that. Sometimes it's because of those kinds of accidents of history and new things happen. But the field was already changing. People were beginning to think differently. Okay? So what you have there, with all these people who are doing research on schizophrenia and experimenting with new methods of therapy, you have a movement already afoot, but it was in search of a theory. How do we understand what we're doing? How do we give words to describe why we do what we do? There were a couple of theories that were being developed for different purposes that ended up being used by this new movement to generate what then becomes a family systems orientation. And I'm just going to name them for you on this slide, and then I'll come back to unpack each one of them. So for those of you who like to have complete notes in your history, right? There was a theoretical biologist named Ludwig von Bertalanffy. Okay, you want to say that with me or no? Ludwig von Bertalanffy, right? Who in German wrote something called general system theory. We often in English translate that as systems theory, but it's actually in the singular. That was one source. Okay, this is coming out of biology. The other is cybernetics. Okay? Cybernetics has to do with information processing systems. And here you're thinking about things like missile guidance systems, right? Or even more simply, the household thermostat. You need something in your household that saves you from having to constantly, the whole day, go over to the wall and say, I need to turn the heat up. I need to turn the air on. It's too hot. It's too cold. You need some instrument that's going to read the temperature of the room and be hooked into the heating and cooling system in such a way that it automatically adjusts the temperature for you within a certain range. That's the field of cybernetics, right? How do you create intelligent machines that are able to take information from their environment, apply a set of rules to it, and then act? Turn on the heater, turn on the air conditioner. Okay, that's what cybernetics is all about. And people begin to think, what if we think of families in those terms, right? So let's look at general systems theory first. Oh, I forgot that I had a picture of a thermostat in there, right? In general systems theory, they began to think of these things called open systems, right? A good analogy for an open system, any living creature is an open system because it interacts with its environment. That's the basic idea. There are such things as closed systems that don't interact with their environment, but for the most part, we're not interested in those. Right? Because that doesn't really exist so much in nature. There are cases in which you can see a closed system, a hermetically sealed environment, that kind of thing, but that illustrates something else. Families interact with their environment. And there are several principles that go along with this open systems kind of view. They have long names, but simple ideas. Okay? The first principle is equipotentiality. Okay? You can't predict the future. That's what it means. Think of it this way, okay? You have two families, and they look very similar to each other, sitting side by side in the same neighborhood. And you look at the kids growing up in that family, and you look at one, and you say, well, that family, well, that kid is really growing up smart. You know, they got a family that really cares, they take good care of the kids, they allow them the kind of freedom, they've got the limits and so on, and that kid's going to turn out to be a really strong adult. That kid's going to come out well adjusted, that kid isn't going to go off the rails when they get to be a teenager. But look at this other family. Look at how the parents treat the children in that family. Look at how there's all this pathology in there. That kid's really going to have trouble when they grow up and so on. And then you wait 20 years, and you find out that the kid from the good family has gone off the rails, and the kid from what you would have considered to be the pathological family has actually turned out okay. How does that happen? I'm not saying that this is the way it's normally going to happen, but the reason that you sometimes see that is because what happens in the family environment when they're young isn't the whole story. That child is going to interact with a number of other people over the course of time. That's going to change the direction that that child is going to go. I remember reading a book some years ago by a sociologist named Lillian Rubin, who wrote a book called The Transcendent Child. And what she was talking about in this book is case studies and interviews that she had done with a number of children who had horrendous childhoods. You would have predicted that they never would have been able to grow up and have a stable career or a stable marriage or be good parents with all of the abandonment and abuse and so on that they had faced as children. And she wanted to find out what made the difference. How is it that these children from such terrible backgrounds could grow up to have such a stable future? Not to say that they don't have issues. They do have issues, but they're able to hold things together. Why is that? And one of the things that she found out, for example, was that one characteristic that most of these kids seem to share in common is that they had the ability to attract mentors. And those mentors came from all different kinds of places. Some of them would be other relatives in the family. an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent. Some of them would be teachers. Some of them would be youth pastors. Some of them would be high school coaches. Some adult that they could attract to them, that would care enough for them to guide them. That kind of intervention, that kind of additional element in their life that could not have been predicted from their childhood is what helped them to get to a particular place. Right? So the idea of an open system is if you have this other source of influence in your life, because families are open systems, it's not all about parents, then it's possible that some other unpredictable future can be had. Now, the flip side of that would be what they call equifinality, and that is you can't be sure about the past. If what I just said is true about not being able to predict the future because people have numerous relationships across their lifetime, it also goes the other way. If you see somebody now, today, who seems to be either in really good shape or really bad shape, you cannot 100% say, well, you must have come from a bad family. Or you must have come from a good family. Right? Everybody who gets to the same place has the same origin. It doesn't work like that. Because, again, you have a number of influences along the way that shape who you are. That's one set of ideas from open system theory. Another is the fact that it isn't just one system, but each system has subsystems in it. Okay? Think about your church. Okay? Your church as an organization, as a group of people, is itself a system. There is a certain set of standards that go along with that. There are certain expectations that go along with that, patterns of relationship that happen in the congregation. Within your congregation, you have subsystems. You have groups of people that work together on particular ministries, and they have their own expectations as a group. And within your church, you have families. And those families have their own identity and their own expectations. And within each family, you may have subgroups as well. So that the relationship between mom and dad is not the same as the relationship between siblings. Because there may be a whole bunch of siblings, and they can operate as a group themselves, sometimes in contradistinction to the parents, right? And depending on the ages of the children, you might have a couple of older siblings who have a particular kind of relationship, while the younger siblings have a relationship with each other. That's not to say that they don't relate across those boundaries, but there are certain rules and patterns that go along with each one of these. So you can think about it like a series of nested Russian dolls, you know? It's that kind of thing. You might have a large system, but within that system you have many, many other systems. Every single one of them can look to the larger system that they're a part of. That will to some extent shape the way that they are and how they think, but they also have rules in particular to the people that are in that system. And finally, this idea of non-summativity, basically the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And here, the way you want to think about it is to say, all right, if I have a group of people and I want to understand what the dynamics in that group are going to be, I could start by going and giving every single member of that group a complete psychological workup. A whole battery of tests, understand everything about their personality and that kind of thing. And I still won't know what it means for that group to have an identity and what that identity is going to be. Because there are certain patterns of relationship that emerge when two people get into a room with each other that can't be entirely predicted from those individual characteristics. And you have to look at the system as a whole to know what that actually is. So there's something about the whole that can't be reduced to the sum of its parts. Now, if you've ever tried to put together a do-it-yourself kind of kit, okay, or you go to IKEA, or something like that. You know, IKEA, everything is do-it-yourself. You get the box down off the shelf, you take it home, there's a piece of paper, and they don't even try to describe things anymore, they just do pictures, right? They show you a picture of something upside down and they put an X through it. Don't do that. You need this, and you need to put this here, and then you show the little stick figure guy who's like freaking out because he's got things wrong, and so on. If you've ever done a do-it-yourself kit, you know the difference between a box of parts and a fully assembled piece of furniture. Because in order for that fully assembled piece of furniture to look and to function the way that it's supposed to, all of the parts have to stand in the right relationship to each other. If they don't, you've got a pile of parts, or you've got modern sculpture, or some such thing, right? So there's a difference between a collection of parts and a finished whole. And this is what it's like with families. This is what it's like with social systems. You have all the parts, and every part has a role to play. But you don't know what you've got other than a pile of parts until they all stand in a particular relationship to each other, okay? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about family systems. That's the systems, open systems point of view, okay? What about cybernetics, this other thing that we mentioned? What does that have to contribute to the conversation? Here, the emphasis had tended to be, especially in the early days of family therapy, on patterns of verbal and nonverbal communication. I mentioned before that, for example, there were some people who were studying schizophrenia in the 1950s who said sometimes the problem that you saw in the family was one of communication. The classic case is of a young man who had been hospitalized for schizophrenia back then, and he was relatively non-communicative with the hospital staff and so forth, but he was stable. And there came a day in which his mother came to visit him, and he had been doing some work in therapy and so on. His mother came to visit him, and he was glad to see her. So his mother walks in the door, and he walks over to her, and he gives her a hug. It's Mom, Mom's here, and give her a hug. And what does she do? She goes like this, and she stiffens up. All right? Now, think about it. If you were someone who spontaneously went over to your mother or somebody else and you gave them a hug and they did this, what would you do? You back off, right? Because what message are you getting? Yeah, don't touch me. I don't want a hug from you. What are you doing? That kind of thing. So he backed off. He read her nonverbal behavior correctly, and he backed off. And the next thing that she said to him was, "What's the matter? Don't you love me anymore?" Okay? Now imagine growing up in a family in which the communication is like that on a constant basis. Right? I will say things to you with my words, and I'm going to hold you accountable for listening to that. But if you do that, okay, so you don't love me, so that means I need to give you a hug. But if I give you a hug, what you're going to do is you're going to stiffen up and tell me that you don't want me to hug you, and I don't know what to do. And imagine that that's going on from the time that you were a child and trying to figure out what the world is all about. Right? That's where the whole matter of trying to sort out the contradictions between what we say and what we do ends up being important. And this is one of those distinctions that I would like you to keep thinking about. How is it that in our relationships, oftentimes, the confusion is, well, that's not what I said. Right? Well, I didn't. You feel this way, or you're this way. I didn't say that. Well, yeah, but you're demonstrating it in some other way. And it almost feels unfair for somebody to point to our nonverbal behavior and hold us accountable for that. But this is what's going on all the time, and unless we can actually begin to notice those kinds of things and actually be able to have the freedom to say, well, wait a minute, this is what seems to be going on to me. Can we talk about that? Then it's going to be really hard to sort out some of those kinds of knots, right? So the tendency tended to be emphasizing verbal and nonverbal communication. And therapists would look at the ways that families communicate and say, okay, just like with a thermostat or some other cybernetic device, there's usually some kind of rules of operation. Your household thermostat has a setting on it. When do you turn on the heat? When do you turn on the air conditioning? And it's possible you can go in and change those settings, but that machine is always going to operate according to those settings as long as it's set like that, right? Well, what therapists would do is look at the family and say, what kinds of rules do we see operating here that perhaps they're not even aware of their existence, right? And some therapists will do the kind of thing, instead of, here's your office, and instead of inviting people into your office and saying, okay, so Mom, why don't you sit there, and Dad, why don't you sit there, and you cute kids, you sit here, that kind of thing. You just step back and let them walk in and sit down themselves. And oftentimes what they do is they demonstrate when they sit down something about their family. Right? Here's mom on one corner, here's dad on the other corner looking out the window, right? And here are the two kids sitting next to mom huddling with her. That probably tells you something about the family. That would be a little bit different than mom and dad sitting together, huddling with each other in the middle of the couch and the kids running around the room. Right? Every single way that they organize themselves is going to tell you something about the family, including the way that they communicate with each other. And so, you know, typical thing that a lot of American family therapists will do, you get family in, and they'll violate all the Asian cultural rules by asking the kids a question first. Right? And the kids will not, the eyes will go wide. You know, it's kind of like, uh-oh, now what do I do? And they'll turn and they'll look at their parents. And the parents will give some kind of subtle either acknowledgement, or if it's okay for the kid to do it, you know, out of respect for the therapist, there'll be a little... And that's about all you're going to get. Right? But from that, the child knows, okay, I can answer the question. Probably while they're answering the question, they're going to keep going like this. Say, did I get that right? Is it okay for me to say that? But the therapist should be able to tell by watching that, okay, so we've got a rule here. Right? The rule is children don't speak before adults. The rule is if an adult asks a child to answer the question, they're going to have to check with the parents first. And all of that is being communicated by the family through the way that they behave with one another. Now, sometimes you've got rules then that are going on in a family that they don't even know they have. And the idea is that it might be that it's the rule that's the problem. Because the difficulty is that the family is always undergoing change. There are always adjustments that need to be had. Think about what it means to be a couple that has no children. You have certain ways of doing things. You have a baby born into the family, and that's going to put new demands on the family. You're going to probably have to change at least some things about what you do. Like, you know, all due respect to what I said last night, you might not be able to expect to get a full night's sleep every night. Sometimes you might not expect to get more than a few hours when you have a baby in the household, depending on the baby, right? So some things are going to have to change. The question is, when things change, how well do you adapt to those kinds of demands? And some families have rules that make it very difficult for them to do that. Okay? Let me give you an example of that. You have a child in the family, and you determine for the child when that kid's bedtime is going to be. And as they grow older, you decide, okay, you know, you're a little bit older, I'll let you stay up a little bit longer. When I was a kid, we had to go to bed at 7:30. And then the next year it was 8 o'clock, and the next year it was 8:30. And it was really hard during the summer, during daylight savings. Because you're going to bed 2 hours before the sun goes down, and you're lying in bed. And as we got older, we got, you know, another half an hour, another half an hour, another half an hour, and that kind of thing. But there comes a point at which the discussion changes. You get to be a teenager, and now it's, yeah, but none of my friends have to go to bed at 8:30 or whatever, and I want to be out, and I want to be with my friends, and that kind of thing. And it's not just a matter of whether or not the parents can say, okay, well, I'll let you stay out till 10:30, I'll let you stay out till 11 o'clock, as long as you use your cell phone and you call me, and that kind of thing, right? Because if that's the conversation, then essentially there's one thing that doesn't change, and that's who calls the shots, right? The parents still call the shots. You will do things my way. That's different than the parent, for example, saying, okay, you're practically an adult now. In some cases you are an adult. Right? Legally speaking, you're an adult, but you'll never be an adult in my mind. That's the way that works. But to say, all right, what's important to me is your schoolwork. I need to know that you're giving everything that you can to make sure that you do as well as you possibly can in school. And in order to do that, I know, because I went to this retreat, that you need sleep. Okay? So, how are you going to get the sleep that you actually need and get your homework done and keep your grades up? And to give the child some freedom to be able to decide how they're going to meet those goals within their own resources. That's a different conversation. Because now it engages the child at a level in which they get some say in their own behavior. And this is one of the tension points in families, is as kids grow up, oftentimes it's a matter of, okay, so what I used to do was I made all the rules and I told kids where they could go and what they could do and when they could do it and that kind of thing. And when change starts to happen in the family, parents try to do the same thing. Therapists had a really sophisticated term for that. They called it more of the same. Okay? But this was part of the problem. Why is it that the family's in treatment? Why is it the family's having trouble? It's not because of the kid alone. It's because the parents are trying to solve the problem using the same techniques they always did. Well, gee, it always worked before that if I just got bigger and louder, that they would just do what I said. But now, they're getting bigger and louder. And it's just getting intolerably loud in the household. People are shouting, that's not what I anticipated. And the parents, frankly, are flabbergasted. They don't know where to go with that. And even sometimes the simplest suggestion, why don't you try this, changes the nature of the conversation and just unlocks the problem in and of itself. So sometimes the problem is in the way that we try to solve the problem. And the problem is in the way that we try to solve the problem. Or I can say that differently. Part of the problem arises from the changes that are coming on the family, changes that you often don't have any control over, but it's your attempt at a solution and your attempt to do the same thing over and over and over again that keeps the problem going and doesn't solve it. But here's where sometimes we find ourselves in any system facing a problem, and there's one thing we know how to do, and we keep doing it. And we figure that if we keep doing it, and we just do it loudly, and we do it more intensely, and we do it with more intensity, right? That sooner or later, if I just up the tempo enough, it's going to solve the problem, and you find the problem keeps getting worse. At some point, you have to back off and say, okay, what else could I do? What are the different ways that I might approach that? And it might take an entire revolution in the way that you think about the situation. So for therapists who thought that way, typically it came down to, all right, I have the power and the expertise, it's my responsibility to design an intervention that's going to provoke the family into a change. It's going to make them reorganize, sometimes make them reorganize in ways that they're absolutely surprised at. I could trot out a whole bunch of case studies for you on that, but some of those interventions are incredibly counterintuitive. There's a kind of thing that says, the therapist did what? But the whole point was, you realize that the family has a problem. The problem is that the rules that they're using, the methods they're using to solve the problem is keeping the problem going. And if you can do something that shakes them up, they will spontaneously reorganize at a different level, in a different way. And that's what therapists often did in the early days. That's not something that I typically recommend to my students. It's the kind of thing that is very touchy to do, and if you don't get it right, it's a problem. You've just created another problem. So it's a very touchy way of working with people, but it does help us to understand how systems actually work. Now, over time, there were then, after that, a number of different ways of thinking about systems. And some people like to sort of hijack the terminology and say, if you're a systems therapist, you work like this. My way of thinking is there's lots of ways to be a systems therapist, provided that you're always able to think in terms of relationships and not just individuals. That's really the key. Can you think in terms of relationships and not just individuals? Now, if you want to, while you're thinking that way, there are certain things you can focus in on. So you can focus in on the way that family members communicate with each other. That's fine. You can do that and still be a systems therapist. You can think about the way in which family members behave towards one another. Take a more behavioral approach. And to realize, as a behaviorist might say it, that there's something reinforcing in a parent's behavior that keeps a child's behavior going. So you think that, for example, you are disciplining a child, but in reality, in some way, you're reinforcing the behavior, rewarding it by giving it attention. And if you were, in some cases, to stop paying so much attention to the child that seems to be problematic, sometimes the behavior will go away on its own, and so on, right? You can think in terms of meaning and story and narrative. That sometimes what needs to happen is to provoke a change in the way that the family actually thinks about who they are. And what's happening in my individual story and what's happening in the family story. There are creative ways to work with that. That can still be a systemic orientation. And some people focus in on the underlying emotions, patterns of what's been called attachment, and how well do children actually form particular emotional bonds with their parents, and if that's missing, what's the personality consequence for that, and how do they take that into their adult relationships so that it shapes the way that you participate in your marriage and the kinds of expectations that you have with your spouse and so on. Okay? All of those can be systemic in orientation when what you're doing is thinking about patterns of relationship within the family. So let me try to sum all that up so that we have the takeaway are the big ideas and the really big ideas. Okay? Whether you ever remember the term cybernetics or Ludwig von Bertalanffy, I love saying that name. It's just one of those things that rolls off the tongue so nicely. So here are the big ideas, right? Families have goals, and families have identities. There's something that defines what makes me a member of this family as opposed to some other family. There are certain things that we have in common. There are certain markers, maybe traditions and rituals that we go through that said this is what it means to be a member here in this family. I've asked kids, I think my students as kids. I've asked students sometimes to talk about some of the traditions that they have in their families that make their family special. And there are some really, really unusual ones. And you probably have some in your own families as well. My favorite is the one that said, okay, so what does your family do when they get together for Christmas? Well, you know, ours is a musical family. We love to sing Christmas carols together. So what we do is whenever the family gets together at Christmas, we all gather around and we sing Christmas carols. But we do it in the bathtub. Fully clothed, in case you were wondering. But we do it in the bathtub. Really? Why in the bathtub? Because the acoustics are the best in the bathtub. It's like singing in a European cathedral, right? The sound sort of echoes off the tile everywhere. So that's what makes their family special. I'm pretty sure there aren't a lot of families that do that, right? And this is what it means to say, okay, so if I'm going to date somebody and marry somebody, I have to marry somebody who's okay with singing Christmas carols in the bathtub. Seriously, right? Because if you say that to your intended, you know, the person that you're dating, you're starting to get serious about, this is what they do, and they go, what? And they think that you're weird, that's probably not the person you're going to marry. We have certain goals, we have certain identities as families that mark us off as different, as special, but families are always interacting with their environment. That becomes more and more the case as children grow. You know, you sort of cocoon a little bit when you've got babies at home, but then they go off to school. And when they go off to school, suddenly you're arranging play dates and you're interacting with teachers and school systems and all those kinds of things. And you go through one of the things that every parent with school kids goes through, and that is, when my kid goes out to school, they're representing me. And whatever it is that my kid does at school, people are going to think it's me. If my kid misbehaves, it's like, what is going on at home? What is wrong with those parents? Right? I mean, let's be honest, if we've ever been in child care at church, you know, serving kids, and you get kids that are interacting, there's something in your brain that is saying, those kids, look at the parents. Those parents really got to get things together. Right? What is it that they're doing that makes a kid like that? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But those kids go out, they represent the family, and it just spirals outwards from there as they get older, and then they get married, and suddenly you find yourself related to people that you never would have chosen to be related to in the first place, and on it goes. So families interact with their environment, they're always adjusting to that. The families themselves are a social environment. I love the way that one person is put it. He says, he's writing from a more narrative point of view, he says, to be born into a family is something like walking onto the third act of a play that's already in progress. Right? You don't really, despite what, you like the American mythology, you can be anything you want to be. If you just try hard enough, you can be anything you want. Despite that kind of American mythology, the reality of it is, you don't get to write your own script. To some extent, you are already who it is that God has made you, right? And like it or not, I'm never going to slam dunk a basketball. That's just not happening, okay? Not anytime soon. Maybe with a resurrection body. I'm hoping that, in the resurrection I get to slam dunk. We'll see how that actually works. But you are who you are. There are certain limits and certain potentials that you have, and you are walking into a story already in progress. There are only certain identities and certain ways that you can go given the family that you're born into. That's not a bad thing. That's just how it is. Okay? So families are a social environment. We can think of the developmental consequences, okay, of certain certain past patterns of interaction. So it does matter how you're brought up. Again, people who work from an attachment perspective would say that very, very strongly. That if your parents respond to you in a particular way with respect to how you grow up emotionally, you can take that pattern with you into your marriage relationship, and it may show up in your marital conflicts later. Or you can think of the behavioral and the emotional consequences of current patterns of interaction. And this is where marital therapists and family therapists particularly focus their energies. You get a couple into the room. It's one of those things that I try to tell couples when I do marriage seminars, for example. That is, please do not do the kind of thing that happens so often in families, and that is, typically, if there's conflict between the husband and the wife will go to the husband and will say something like, we need to go to therapy. And the husband's response is not, gee, honey, that's a great idea, let's go tomorrow. The husband's response tends to be, I don't need to go to therapy, but if you want to go to therapy, be my guest. And I'll show you what a generous guy I am, because I'll even pay for it. And sometimes what happens is she says, okay, so I'll go to therapy. She finds herself a therapist, gets engaged in that relationship, and she actually starts working through some of the things that she comes back home, she's calmer. And the husband says, this is really worth the money that I'm paying. Things are calmer at home. And 6 months down the line, she says to him, I want a divorce. And he says, well, wait a minute, I thought you were in therapy. And she says, I am in therapy. That's how I got the strength to ask you for a divorce. Now, the problem here is that if what's really going on is not a matter of the individual, but of the relationship, it is dangerous to send one individual to therapy and for the therapist to only get one side of the story. What you need to be working with is the relationship. You need someone who's able to see how the husband and wife interact with each other and change that. Because if the presenting problem is the marriage, it's the marriage that needs to be dealt with. And so I try to warn people off of doing that because it happens too often. It happens too often. I've heard of pastors referring their couples off to some Christian, even a Christian counseling clinic, and it ends up in divorce because they're doing individual therapy instead of marital therapy. So there are consequences and patterns of interaction that you actually have in the family now, and you need somebody who's going to be able to work with those patterns and to help change them. One of the other big ideas that goes along with that in the early days of family therapy, they coined these two words. I can't say they actually coined the word scapegoat. You remember the concept of the scapegoat even from the scripture, where that comes at one point in the year in which all of the sins of the people are laid upon the goat, okay, and sent off into the wilderness ritually, right? The same kind of metaphor was being used for family members, where there was one person in the family who was the presenting problem. This is the person who, the kid who's going off the rails in school, right? They're getting involved in things that they shouldn't be getting into, and so on. Okay? That's the person who needs to be fixed. And the idea of the scapegoat is, well, actually, we use that term to remind ourselves that even though this person is the one that has the symptom, the family is the one that has the problem. And we need to be working with the whole family system to be able to identify what we can do about that individual. Same thing with the term identified patient. This individual is not the patient. This individual is the one that the family identifies as the patient. Hey, just fix our kid and everything will be okay. Hey, just fix my wife and everything will be okay, and so on, right? Is a way of reminding ourselves we need to look at the system and see whether or not what they're saying is actually true. Yeah?
Cameron, just a clarification just now when you said that for a couple with problems, they have to be seen as a couple.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not possible, especially in
Yeah.
Chinese families.
Right.
And even with an individual who is committed to the marriage.
Right.
And it depends on how you do the therapy. You can still make some changes through one person.
Right.
You know? And secondly, in very, as you know, intensely high conflict couples,
Right.
to meet them together all the time, just wasting their money. They
Yeah.
fight all the time, they run out of office, they almost punch one another.
Yeah.
You might have to see them separately for a while, but it's still systems,
Right.
and you put them together. So,
And and the issue is, it's not that there's always one way of working
Right.
with a couple that's going to work for everyone,
Right.
but the person who is doing the work needs to understand systems,
Yeah.
right?
Okay, good.
Because part of the question is, when you're working with an individual, and we want to think about this the same way, even if you're not working as a therapist and somebody is coming to you for advice, right, about what's happening in their marriage, even if you're not able to work with the two of them, part of the question that you need to constantly keep in mind is, am I sending this person back into the relationship in a way that empowers them in that relationship? Because so much of what we want to do is we want to offer empathy to people, and I understand how you're feeling, and gee, isn't that too bad, and that kind of thing. What it does is it reinforces a kind of victim way of thinking about the relationship, and you really don't get a sense of where the responsibility might actually be. So we're always wanting to think about how is it that this is going to empower that person, even if we're just talking with an individual, right? How is it going to empower them in relationships? Thank you for that. Right? So here are the really big ideas, just start thinking of, okay? The problems and the strengths in families are often problems of relationship, okay? Problems in families are often problems of relationship, not problems of individuals. Sometimes it is, right? But even when you've got somebody who has an identifiable problem, you still have to raise the question of how are other people responding to that? And how is the way that they are responding keeping the problem going? And so on, right? So that's the first thing. Problems are problems of relationship. And if you want to change the family, you may need to stop looking for problematic individuals. Okay? Stop looking for problematic individuals and instead find the problematic patterns of relationship instead. Where are the problematic patterns of relationship? And sometimes it has to do with the matter of communication. Let me just give you an example of that, okay? You can think of a married couple, two individuals that come into a relationship. Each one of them has certain areas of sensitivity. Different marital therapists, for example, have different ways of talking about some of the issues that we typically bring with us. So for me, for example, and this is particularly true for a lot of men in relationships, one of the things I really hate, is having my competence questioned. Right? Whenever my wife says something to me, there's this kind of a filter there that takes it as if what she's saying is, what's the matter with you? Don't you know how to do anything? And you have to know my wife. She never says anything like that. And she never means to say anything like that. But somehow that's what I hear. Now, if I respond on that basis, we've got a problem, right? Very concretely, I like to cook. I grew up cooking in my own home. I learned how to cook from my mother. And can I just say, we were talking about making sure that you eat healthy and that kind of thing. You got to eat your vegetables. Can I say that outside of the Chinese community, nobody knows how to cook vegetables? Can I just say that? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I learned how to cook from my mother, and I did a lot of cooking in our relationship, and I still do, right? But I don't cook from recipes. You know, I cook the way that my mother cooked, which is you look in the refrigerator and you see what you've got and you put something in it. And you make sure that you use, you know, the certain kinds of spices and things that you have in the cabinet and so on. And every once in a while, that means I'm also cooking for company. We have people coming over, right? So I'm standing at the stove and I'm cooking, and I'm not really paying attention to what I'm doing. You know, sometimes you unless you taste everything, before you go on to the next step, you realize, okay, so I just put in like 3 tablespoons of fish sauce and now I've got the salt shaker in my hand. Maybe that's not a good idea, but I've got the salt shaker and I'm sort of sprinkling salt in there, and my wife walks by and she sees what I'm doing and she says, "Honey, don't you think that's enough salt?" And of course, what she's thinking, what's going on in her head is, we have company coming, you're cooking for them, and I'm worried that what will happen is if the food is too salty, everyone's going to be polite. You know, they'll take 3 bites of it and they'll say they're full. Right? Because it's too salty to eat. They're not going to insult the cook. Right? I do have some friends who would have no problem insulting the cook. But for the most part, you know, and so that's her concern. She is not telling me you don't know how to cook, but that's what I hear. You don't know how to cook. And so my response is not this nice, calm, so I hear you saying that. You're concerned about whether the food is going to be too salty. My reaction, and I kid you not, is to put the salt shaker down. Would you like to cook? Okay, now I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I know there are a bunch of guys in this room that do just that. Right? Instead of like, honey, do we need to pull over at a gas station because we seem to be lost? What, do you want to drive? That's an interaction problem as much as it is an individual problem. I've got my stuff. I need to do something about that, right? I need to be able to sort of step back and go, okay, so I get it. I know who my wife is. I know what kind of a person she is. And I know that what I'm hearing is not what she's saying. But what happens so often in a couple relationship is I respond on the basis of what's going on inside of me, and then that's going to trigger her issues. And then she responds on that basis, which just makes me madder. And so then I respond and she gets madder, and then I get madder, and on it goes until somebody just ends up either blowing up or leaving the room. That's how it works, right? And what it takes is for people to begin to recognize, well, wait, whoa, what's going on between us? What do we need to do about that? I try to tell people, you know, sometimes, and this is the value of doing premarital work with couples before they actually tie the knot, is because early in the relationship, sometimes you get patterns established between 2 people that are actually very simple to do something about, if they know about it. If they know that they're falling into that, they can check it, they can change it. But you get them 15 years into a relationship when they've been doing this to each other for all that time, and all those 15 years saying, well, look how bad my husband is, and look how bad my wife is, you have a lot harder time trying to change anybody's mind by the time you get 15 years out. And so being able to work with couples before they get into that place is worth a lot for their marriages, right? So we're looking for patterns of relationship. Stop looking for problematic individuals, start looking for problematic relationships, okay? That's the really big idea. We can go ahead and take a break now. It's 10:23. Let's take a break for 10 minutes, okay? Now we'll come back, finish the lecture, and we'll have a discussion. I'm not the only person that does this, right? There are a few different orientations from people who are writing from something of a psychology background or sociology background about congregations and congregational families and that kind of thing, tend to come down in a few different places in terms of the theoretical orientation. And what I'm going to give you today, right now, is one of those. Tomorrow I'll give you another one. Okay, so let's take a look at that. First of all, we're thinking about family systems, how do we then begin to think of congregations themselves as systems? I've tried to say it in such a way that we're not just talking about families, but families provides a way into thinking about even larger systems. What might it be like to think about the congregation as a whole, as a system, or if you will, as a family? But the church is a family. We of course have that language already. We tend to think about our brothers and sisters, and we talk about our church family. That language is there in Scripture. It's even there in the way that we talk about that. So now the question becomes not a matter of whether or not we can imagine churches as families, but it becomes a matter of when we imagine churches as families. What does that say to us? What other kinds of ideas come in with that? How might we be able to understand the church family if we're thinking about how other people actually understand families? One of the few social organizations that we have in any community in which whole families are actually involved is the church. I'm on the board of an organization that does parent education, for example, and they have a unique model in terms of how they do that. They've changed things up a little bit over time, but the original model was we'll start with churches, and with those churches we will find parents who are interested in impacting parent-child relationships in the community, and we'll go through those parents by having them trained as trainers, as educators, and then we'll go to the school system. And within the school system, we're going to go to the principals and we're going to go to the district superintendents and we're going to talk to them about how they can use some of their specially earmarked money that's supposed to be there for parent enrichment and use it for this program and bring in the people from church to do the actual teaching. The reason they did that is because they know that especially in some communities that tend to have a lot of transition and instability, the two most stable social institutions in those communities are church and school. And if somehow you could mobilize the two of those together in order to serve families, you would have a nice stable base of operation to work with. Well, in that organization, they've tended to now move more towards working mostly with schools and getting the parents of those school children to be the educators themselves. But the point is that churches are often a point of focus in terms of where are you going to go to find a place where people of different generations can all belong and all interact with each other, right? It's the church. The church is not only a family, the church is sometimes a three-generational family. You've got people of all three generations, and that doesn't happen in very many places. Ed Friedman was trained by a therapist named Murray Bowen. We'll talk about Murray Bowen's theory in just a minute. Ed Friedman was a rabbi, and having been trained by Bowen, he began to think about his work and about synagogues in terms of Bowen's theory, and began to notice how this seemed to be true of Protestant congregations as well. Now, with his own ministry experience, he wrote a book about that. He went traveling and lecturing to people all across the United States. His book ended up being quite successful in a way that typically books of that kind are not, because it was a unique idea. And he made a couple of observations about churches. He said, notice how it is that families go through a number of different transitions in their lives. We've talked about some of those already. You know, your kids grow up. They're babies at first. You know, there's already the transition to having a baby. The baby grows up, becomes a toddler. That's another transition. The toddlers become school-age children. The school-age children become teenagers, heaven help us. While we're going through some other transitions as adults, they grow up. Often they get married. They move out. They move back. They move out. They move back. You bring in in-laws, there comes a point at which you retire. All those transitions are often there. And the church is often present with families at certain key transitions in their life. When a child is born, when a child is baptized, when people get married, when people die, when there's been changes in a family's life, significant changes in family life, they often need to mark that transition with something that happens at church. And Friedman says, you know, it's at those times that families are the most open to change. This is where they're struggling with that whole more of the same thing. How do we deal with what's happening here? We could try doing the same old thing, but there's the possibility that we could do something new because everything seems to have been, sort of put in a box and then thrown up in the air. And we don't know how things are going to come down. They're probably not going to come down the box the same way that they did before. And if the church is already there, there is a ministry opportunity. If we're thinking about how it is that we help families understand what's going on, right? Now, I'm sure that you've had that kind of experience, for example, when you're doing weddings or you're doing funerals, memorial services, that kind of thing. I've been in a situation in which I'm doing a memorial service for a man who in his 50s had struggled with depression for most of his adult life, and even when he was younger, and committed suicide. And we're talking about a church family, a devout church family, trying to make sense out of their son taking his own life. You don't just go through the normal ritual and just say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. You have to address the questions of meaning in that. You have to help them come to a place where they are able to say, okay, I get it. I know what this tragedy is all about, and yet I still believe that God is present. Right? These are the points at which families are open to ministry in a way that they aren't on a typical Sunday. And Friedman is saying we have those kinds of opportunities and we need to take advantage of that in terms of what it is that we're actually doing. And he says, and beyond that, not only do we have 3 generations of families that are involved in the congregation, not only do we have people here when they are the most open to change, when they're going through those transition points, but there is no other social organization that is as much like a family as the church. Okay? Now, that can mean a couple different things to you. On the one hand, if you grew up in a really healthy, strong, loving family, you say, the church is like family. Hallelujah. That's what I want. And this is why people come to a particular congregation. It's not just the preaching. That's part of it, but it's not just that. It's like, what does it feel like to be here? What are the people like? Are they welcoming? If I'm a visitor to your church, do I walk in the door and feel like nobody actually wants to say hi to me because I'm a stranger? And so I have to be satisfied with just whether or not I like the sermon and the music or some such thing. Or do they welcome me in? Do I see relationships between them where they seem like, you know what, these people actually care about each other. They actually seem to love each other. I want to find out what's going on here. So when we say that the church is like a family, it could be good news. And sometimes, depending on the family that you grew up with, that might not be great news. Right? Yeah, well, the thing about the family that I grew up with, if the church is going to be like that, I'm not so sure. The same kinds of relationship issues that happen there. And it's not either or, is it? It can be a bit of both. As I suggested earlier, there are some churches that seem to do a really good job of being able to reach out to people and to love them and to support them and to be there for them, even though they struggle mightily with some political issues, with issues of organization, with issues of power and all of those kinds of things. So it's not either or, but the recognition that churches are like families should help us realize there's some things we love about it, and there are other things that we wish we could change. And maybe thinking about the ways families might help us to do that. Now the theory of Murray Bowen, that's the person that I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is, again, if you look at the literature that's out there in the ministry literature right now, there's several books that are written from the perspective of Bowen theory. I use a little of that in my own writing as well. So let me give you kind of an overview of that and show you how it might actually help us understand some of the things that happen in congregations so that we can begin to think about, well, what significance might this have for us? I mentioned already that back in the 1950s, there were various people that were doing research on schizophrenia and were beginning to develop theories about, well, why do we see these kinds of things in families' lives? Why do we see these individuals having those kinds of problems? And we're developing radical theories about, well, maybe it has to do with the patterns of interaction in those families. That there's something about those families that needs to be changed in order to change that, what seems to be a purely individual symptom. Murray Bowen's research was one of those theories. Okay? And the way that he was actually working with it, he was observing mother-daughter dyads. So you have a young woman who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia and hospitalized, and he would watch what would happen when mom came to visit. Prevailing theories those days tended to blame mothers, and that was often true in earlier days of psychology. Moms got blamed for anything that happened that went wrong with the kid, right? Nobody asked the question as to whether or not dads were to blame, because the dads weren't around. They weren't involved with what was happening with the kids, and nobody thought to ask, well, maybe that's part of the problem in and of itself. So Bowen would actually observe the interaction between mothers and daughters, and what he actually expected was that, because again, the prevailing theory was a psychoanalytic one, and that moms were somehow so needy that what they were doing was essentially stealing a little bit of the child's independence and selfhood to make themselves complete, but leaving the child incomplete. And so what he expected to see is that when mom comes to visit the daughter, they would fuse with each other emotionally in such a way that you couldn't tell where one person stops and the other one begins. And who was supposed to be actually having this feeling and who wasn't, just because they got basically, that whole idea of emotional contagion that we talk about today. This is why it is that you would sometimes rather watch a basketball game in the stadium than watch it at home. Or if you're going to watch it at home, you need to have some friends with you. Because it's one thing to be sitting in a recliner watching the game by yourself, and it's another thing to be watching it with 12,000 people. And something happens, and you just can't help yourself. And everybody else is going like that, and you don't just sit there. Right? You feel compelled to join in, and it's a different kind of experience. Well, that happens in families too, right? Whatever emotion one particular person is experiencing will often influence the emotion that another person is experiencing. Sometimes, again, it's hard to tell where one person stops and the other one begins. So what he expected was to see that when mom came, they would fuse with one another. But what he actually saw was that when moms came, they would in fact fuse with one another, but then at some point they would distance from each other emotionally. They would pull apart from each other, but when they did that, they often then fused with somebody else. So the daughter might have distanced from her mother, but then she goes and fuses with a doctor, or another family member that happens to be visiting, or maybe an intern, or something like that. And so there's this cycle of both fusion and distance, and fusion and distance. And what Bowen came to, when he was thinking about that, he says, it's not just about the mom and the daughter. It's about the whole social system. And whoever is available to be able to fuse with them, everybody potentially is going to be implicated in that. So that the circle is much wider than we thought it was at first. Okay? That's what he came to. And he began to then develop his theory and develop particular ideas that go along with that. In particular, his major concept was the idea of differentiation of self. Okay? The differentiation of self. And here, some people have thought about that in terms of the extent to which my own understanding of who I am and my identity is based on how I am, who I am as an individual, as opposed to who we are as a family. And when you, I'll say more about this in a bit, when you read through Bowen theory, sometimes you get the sense, okay, so this guy is coming from a purely modern Western perspective and doesn't really understand what it means to live in a more communal kind of culture, right? He doesn't understand collectivism. And I think there's something to that, but if you keep Bowen theory within certain boundaries, it still makes sense to me. So let me see if I can play that out for you, okay? There is the I and there is the we. There's that sense of who I am as an individual, there's that sense of who we are as a group, and there's always going to be some interplay between those things, right? And it isn't a matter of saying, well, what we need to do is privilege who I am as an individual and get rid of this other stuff because all of that shouldn't be there. Nor is it a matter of saying, oh, it's all about the we and it's not about the I at all. There's always going to be a relative balance between those two. In some places it's going to be this way, in some places it's going to be that way. But let's look at the way that the tension between those two plays out in the social system. Bowen thought of it in terms of saying there is what he calls a core self and a pseudo self. What he meant by that is to say there are parts of who I am that are non-negotiable no matter what context I actually find myself in. Now, easy way of getting at that, for most of us, our gender identity is one of those things. It doesn't matter who else is in the room, it doesn't matter what context I find myself in, I always think of myself as being either a man or a woman, and that doesn't change. But let me then put it in a little bit different framework. What about your identity as a Christian? For many of us, it doesn't matter where we are. I'm a Christian, and I'm always going to be a Christian. And it doesn't matter if I'm with my family or I'm with my coworkers or some other such thing. But hang on a second, because sometimes you get the sense that when I'm with this group of people, yeah, if you were to ask me, I would tell you that I'm a Christian, but I can't be a Christian in the same way with this group of people that I am with this group of people. And I can't be as open with this group of people. And there are certain, that sense that I get, that if I even think about opening a conversation about my faith or about my relationship with God, I feel perfectly comfortable doing that here. But over here with this group, I know that I'm going to get some pushback if I do that. And so it's not as easy for me to do that. Now, realistically speaking, there are going to be those differences. The question is, are there certain aspects of ourselves that are all like this? That it depends on where I am and who I'm with. If you're a Lakers fan and you're in the Staples Center, you're all good to go. Right? But what if you're a fan of the opposing team? It's one of those things that makes me laugh when I watch some of the games throughout the season, is that there are some people who are there to see Steph Curry. It was the same thing with Michael Jordan. It's been the same thing with Kobe Bryant. Right? People will go because they want to see that person. And here it is, you're in hostile territory, right? But the opposing team makes a shot, and there's a whole bunch of people in the stadium go, "Wow!" like that. It's like, you're supposed to be rooting for your own team, aren't you? Isn't that the way that works? Usually speaking, it's not okay to be a fan of the opposing team and to be vocal about it when you're in somebody else's arena, right? You expect to have that kind of pressure, and the question is, how much of ourself is like that? It's negotiable. It depends on where you are. It depends on the social context as to how I can express that, whether I feel comfortable expressing that, whether I feel that there's some kind of a rule that says I can't express that at all. So that's the question. What's negotiable about our identity, and where, and with whom, and what isn't? And the more negotiable parts of ourselves that there are, and the less of the core self that there is, then the less differentiated we are. For Bowen, it's being sure of who you are, and knowing that, and being less susceptible to having to change things because you're with somebody else, right? That's his bias, that's his way of thinking about things. Now he talks about it from an emotional perspective, and he talks about anxiety as being the basic emotion. And you have to understand, if you're one of those people that likes to study theories of emotions and so forth, Bowen doesn't mean the same thing by that some other people do. There have been psychologists and philosophers that have done all typologies of all the different kinds of emotions, and whether or not there are basic emotions and primary emotions and secondary emotions, and how many of them there are, and what sort of physiological signature they have, and so forth. What Bowen is talking about is what some other researchers might call physiological arousal. When you get yourself in a situation and you start feeling stressed out, when you start feeling anxious in that way. I usually, when I'm working with couples, premarital couples, for example, this is one of the things that I want them to learn so that they know when they're getting in trouble so that they can do something about it, instead of just pushing through and doing more of the same and getting themselves deeper and deeper into a pattern that isn't working for them. I want them to identify, how do you know when you're starting to get stressed out? What happens to you? What does your body tell you? Right? For some people, your jaw gets tight. For some people, you start getting a pounding in your temples. Right? Some people, your hands get sweaty. You find it harder to think or to talk, all those kinds of things. It's that kind of physiological response that Bowen is talking about. And what do people do when they experience that? That becomes the key question for the system as a whole, right? What do you do when you experience that? He says, what I've noticed in families is that when you have two people, one of whom or both of whom is beginning to feel that kind of anxiety, what they often do is what he calls triangling. In other words, I'm experiencing anxiety between you and me, and so what I do is either draw in or talk about somebody else or something else, right? So we're starting to get a little tense with each other. I can always say, hey, what about them Lakers? Right? Or, what do you think of Donald Trump? That usually sort of changes the direction of the conversation very quickly, right? Or if you are a family in which there's some tension between the generations and a grandbaby is born into the family, right? There are some often unacknowledged, sort of unresolved issues around parenting and childhood that come across when, the grandparents come in and they're trying to tell the parents, no, that's not how you raise a child, you're supposed to do it like this. And the kids are trying to figure out, so, do I say something? Do I just do it? Do I respond back in some way? If there's tension that comes up between the two older generations, it's always easy to go, oh, look how cute, look what the baby is doing, right? Babies are very handy in that regard. They may be inconvenient in a lot of other ways, but babies give other generations something to point to and talk about that's safe. Right? We can talk about the baby, we can talk about how cute the baby is, and we don't have to deal with what's happening between us. We don't have to deal with the fact that, actually, I just really resent the fact that you just criticized me as a parent. Right? That's what triangling is. We feel anxious, there's some tension in our relationship between us, and the way that we deal with that is by reaching out, changing the subject, talking about somebody else, right? Or actually bringing somebody else into the argument. You go to that other person and say, you know what so-and-so said about you? Murray Bowen, if you read some of the stuff that he wrote early on, and I'm reading it coming from the family background that I do, his stuff is frightening. Because of the things that he did in his family, like I cannot imagine anybody from a Chinese family actually doing what Bowen did in his own family. He's saying, okay, the problem in our family is all these people are triangling other people, they don't talk to each other directly, and what they do is they go and they tell somebody else, or they write them a letter, or that kind of thing. Well, I'm going to blow all that up. And so what he does is somebody comes to him and tells him a story about some other relative, and he goes straight to the other relative and says, you know what so-and-so said about you? Right? Do you know what so-and-so said about you? I'm kind of neutral on that myself, and I'm not sure that I agree, but I thought you should know. Right? And everybody in his family hated him for a while. Go figure, right? And you can sort of imagine it. Everybody in his family hated him for a while, but eventually it came around to the point where they said to him, we don't really understand why you did what you did, but we're kind of glad you did. Because what happened was, when he started blowing up all the triangles, he forced people to talk to each other. Okay? They talk to each other more directly. Now, again, this is one of those things that you have to be careful when people are coming to you for advice about their marriages, right? You need, and whether you're doing that as a pastor or just a friend or a family member, right? One of the things you have to think to yourself is, am I talking to this person in such a way that I'm pointing them back to the relationship? Sam Young brought up, that might be a little bit different if we're talking about a flagrantly abusive relationship or some such thing, right? But oftentimes what happens is we end up being the person that somebody else is coming to, and really the reason that they're coming to us is not really because they want to fix the relationship. They're coming to us because what they want is for a sympathetic ear. And that's fine, we can give them a sympathetic ear, but we need to be aware of the way in which sometimes only giving them a sympathetic ear and not pointing them back to the relationship and not empowering the relationship is just keeping the problem going. Right? We need to think back to ourselves. So, triangling. That's part of the way that we deal with this tension with each other is we involve somebody else, we pull somebody else in, we tell a story about somebody else. Now, again, and you read Bowen theory, some of what he actually did in his family and some of his ways of thinking are in fact too individualistic. There seems to be some privileging of a Western way of thinking and even rationalism. There's a point at which he says in one of his books that we may not be to the point yet where we are able to control our emotions with our intellect, but sooner or later we'll get there. And I think that that's a little bit too rationalistic of a way of approaching life in and of itself. But if you get away from that, and you begin to get more towards what he does in some of his later writing, and to think about the way that the brain is structured, and to think about the fact that we do have emotions that are often triggered in a different part of our brain than the rational, intellectual part of our brain, if I can put it that simply. Bowen makes a lot out of what's known as the prefrontal cortex right here behind my forehead. Probably the last part of the brain to develop when you ask adolescents, why did you do what you did? And they say, I don't know. That's not a dishonest answer. Okay? Because sometimes they don't know. And you can probably think back to experiences that you've had when you were younger. It's not because you couldn't sit down with somebody and sort of rationally walk the whole thing through. Okay? My friends have invited me to do this, and they wanted to do that. And so what's the risk involved? I can tell you. I know exactly what the risk is. I know all of the reasons why I shouldn't do it. And do it anyway. Why? Okay? Well, what some people are saying these days is because our brain development isn't finished yet. And that part of our brain that is used in order to make those kinds of decisions is still on the way to getting where it needs to be. And it might not happen until we get to be in our late 20s or so. Right? That makes for a pretty long adolescence in some ways. Right? If you think of it that way, then you can say, all right. So really what we're talking about here is we have, as adults, the capacity to be able to think about what we're doing. And we have those kind of emotional pushes from the inside of us to do things in a particular way, to move in a particular direction. How do we get those two things to talk to each other? How do we get them to work towards one another? Now, to some extent, Bowen has then a bias towards direct communication, as he did in his own family, right? We don't like this triangle kind of thing. What we need to do is to get people to talk to each other directly and have individual relationships with each other. And I think there's some value to that, but I don't think that that's the be-all and the end-all of what we're talking about with the application of the theory. I don't want to read Bowen theory as a cultural value judgment. Right? In the sense of saying, okay, so what's really healthy is that everybody would communicate with each other like white Americans want to. Right? Let me just be forthright with you and tell you what I'm thinking directly. I don't think that that's a particularly good solution to it. But you do have that question of what some people have called the probable direction of error. And that is this, right? If by nature of our upbringing and culture, there's a particular way that we tend to communicate. That's not wrong in and of itself, but you can predict that if it does go wrong, it's going to go wrong in a particular direction. Right? It's going to go wrong in a particular direction. And that is going to be in the direction, in many cases, of triangling. Okay? I'll give you an example of that in just a bit. Okay? So here's the systemic issue that we need to deal with. How do we typically deal with anxiety? In our social systems, in our families, how do we typically deal with anxiety? And how does that become more of the same? It's the same thing that we always did anytime something challenges us, we do something, but does that exacerbate the problem? Is it a way of dealing with the problem that leaves either the problem itself unresolved or possibly even make it worse? Okay? Again, let me give you an example coming out of my own family, right? I'm one of those people who grew up in my own family with a little bit of a conflictual relationship with my mother. I know you had a hard time imagining that, but there it is. Okay? My mother will sometimes tell me, and she's right, okay? She will sometimes tell me, you're lucky that I'm not a typical Chinese mother. And I know what that means, and like I say, she's right. Of course, that doesn't stop me from resenting the ways in which she is a typical Chinese mother as I was growing up. And so, you have that ongoing conflict and that kind of thing, because we are the two strong personalities in our family. Here's my mother and I. My sister was not, my father was not. If there was going to be anything in the way of either the louder voice or, you know, the person who's going to say, well, this is the way we're going to do things, it would be between her and myself, right? So I grow up and move away and go to seminary. This is one of those things that, you know, I typically have that conversation with my students somewhere in the fall and say, okay, so here's the deal. Some of you have come to Pasadena from far away. This may be the first time that you're away from your families. And what's going to happen is you're going to begin to develop a sense of independent identity and professional identity. You're going to be starting to work with clients and you say, oh, look at me, you know, I'm kind of grown up now. I'm able to help other people with their problems. And then you're going to go home. And you might even sort of think to yourself, okay, so I know how to do this now. I know how to do it. I know the problematic patterns that I've been in with my family, and I'm not going to do that anymore. When I go home, I'm going to be straightforward. I'm going to communicate with my mother this way. We're going to stop this pattern, that kind of thing. And as soon as you walk in the door, boom, boom. Right? Right back to being the same child that you were. It doesn't matter how old you are. It's the same thing all over again, right? So this is what happens. You grow up, you start getting some sense of independence, but it doesn't necessarily change the patterns. You still have the anxiety to deal with, and you have to figure out what to do with that. And so here it is. I was always ambivalent about Mother's Day. Okay? Just being honest. I was always ambivalent about Mother's Day. I know I'm going to be in really big trouble if I don't send her a Mother's Day card. But then I go into the store and I start looking on the rack and here's, Mom, the universe turns on you as an axis. And life would be terrible if it wasn't for your grace and beauty and all that kind of stuff. And I'm looking at these cards, I can't buy that. And so you do what a lot of people do. You buy a humor card. Admit it, right? You buy a humor card because a humor card is safe. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything. But you've done your duty. You've sent the card. Now, of course, my problem was that I was so ambivalent about it that I would wait until the last possible second, and then I would wait until too late. And I would send the card, and it would get there on Monday. So my mother gets the card, and now she's saying, okay, so I got the card, and it's a humor card. Right? But what does that mean that he couldn't get it to me in time for Mother's Day? And so she wants to complain to me, what's wrong with you? You know? How come you didn't think enough about me to send me a card so that I could get the card on Mother's Day? And what she does, of course, is not pick up the phone and call me and tell me that. She talks to my father. And she says to my father, do you know what your son did? Right? I don't know why that is whenever we get into conflict. It's not, do you know what our son did? Do you know what my son did? Do you know what your son did? Right? And it's like a game of hot potato. You know, she's triangled my father into this, and now my father's holding hot potato. And he's trying to figure out what to do with that. So what does he do? Does he pick up the phone and call me and say, you need to talk to your mother, she's upset about the card? No, he tells my sister. And now my sister is holding the hot potato. She's trying to figure it out. Right? And so what she does is she picks up the phone and she calls my house and I answer the phone, right? And then we go through this conversation. We get like 15 minutes of small talk. How are things going? How are you? Oh, I'm fine. You know, and I'm wondering, why is my sister calling? And after about 15 minutes, and oh, by the way, it just occurred to me. Oh, by the way, Mom's really upset. I think you need to talk to her. What's she upset about? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I hang up the phone. My wife is standing next to me. And she's looking at me like this. And she asked me, so what was that all about? And I told her, you know. And then she got this funny look on her face. And I said, what? And she says, you know what? I'll bet she wasn't expecting to find you at home. Because this was an unusual thing for me to be at home at that time of day and for me to pick up the phone. In other words, she was trying to get my wife. And after that, my wife wouldn't have anybody else to triangle in, so she was stuck with that, right? Now, the ending of the story is, for me, for a long time, it's kind of like, all right, well, I've already said my piece and that's it. But, the verse kept coming back to me that says, for him who knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it, it is sin. And I'm like, I get it. And I actually got on a plane and I went to visit my mother, and we spent the entire day talking and hashing it out and resolving the relationship, and things have been fine since that. There are still those points of tension, but there was that point that said, okay, maybe what I need to do is to just go and have that honest conversation with her and to give her credit, because that would be easier for me than it would be for her, right? To give her credit. She was able to hear that, and I was able to hear what she said, and everything was fine from there, okay? But think about how this works in a family. People who can't talk to each other, how do they deal with tension? They triangle somebody else in. And when they triangle somebody else in, that doesn't resolve the tension. All it means is that the chances are somebody else is going to get triangled in. And another person, and another person, and another person, and another person. Now, again, please hear me when I talk about probable direction of error. I am not saying that the standard for all communication needs to be, let me just sit down with you eye to eye, person to person, and tell you exactly what I'm feeling, to tell you exactly what it is that I'm thinking. Because sometimes that's just really not the way to go. And we don't need to change all of that. But the probable direction of error is, if there is already a bias that says, no, I can't do that, it's uncomfortable to do that, it's incorrect to do that, then when the anxiety and the tension and the problem does not get resolved, what will happen is we will perpetuate it by keeping on with the pattern of triangling in another person and another person and another person. This is how the rumor mill works in a church. This is how it is that a person who has nothing to do with a problem ends up finding out about the problem. Because somebody talks to somebody else, talks to somebody else, talks to somebody else, talks to somebody else. And sometimes the way that we do that, even though one word for it would be gossip, the other word for it is prayer request. Right? There are some times in a congregation in which what we do is we share information with other people that we probably should not share, and we do it by way of prayer request. Or would you pray for somebody? They really need God's help. In some ways, we probably all need a little bit of that kind of help. Okay? So if we think about the elements of Bowen theory, try to put that together in a way that we can think about congregations, right? He talks about what he calls the forces of individuality and togetherness. And I'm not quite okay with that language of forces, but you get the idea. In other words, there is some impetus in each one of us to want to be something of an individual at least. Not an individual separate from other people, but to have something of our own identity. And there is also an impetus towards wanting to be with the group and wanting to identify with them. And again, from culture to culture, that balance is going to be a little bit different. So we have that interplay then of what the social requirements are, what the cultural requirements are, and the emotions that I'm experiencing, and how I deal with that, and what seems to be the best and the most productive way to deal with that in this particular context, right? That's part of the generational challenges that you have in churches in which you've got first and second generation, right? First generation parents have a certain way of understanding this is what's right and this is how you do things, and their children are growing up in America and they're learning something else. And what children end up doing in the way that they communicate feels disrespectful to us in the older generation, right? And they're not necessarily meaning to be disrespectful. Sometimes they are. Okay? But they're not always meaning to be disrespectful, but they're playing the game according to a different set of rules. And it doesn't feel right to us. That sometimes is what's happening in terms of the, again, interplay between the social and the emotional dynamics. So when Bowen talks about emotion and intellect, and we'll talk about that in terms of different areas of the brain, right? Really what he's trying to get at is this idea. And that is, when we find ourselves in a certain situation, do we just react to it emotionally in an automatic kind of way, or do we actually have the capacity to choose how we want to act? Do we just react, or do we choose how to act? Saying to ourselves, okay, so what is it that I need to achieve here? And this is again where I have to say to myself, okay, if I just react to what my mother is doing and what she's saying, what I will do is push her away. Distance myself, not want to have anything to do with her. But if I choose instead, and if I listen to, okay, so it must be the Holy Spirit that just kind of keep poking me in the back of my head, right? And if I choose to act, then it's going to cost me something. It means I have to get on a plane and anticipate having a long conversation that I probably don't even want to have. But that's choosing to act as opposed to just reacting to a situation, and that's what we're trying to get at. Now, how might all of that then actually explain some of the things that happen in a church, okay? In a congregation? Well, let's think about triangles and how they actually work, okay? What happens? If we're assuming that people are not well differentiated from each other, we tend to just react rather than act. Okay, so here's me over in the corner, and here's you, and we have a good relationship with each other. I'm going to symbolize that with green arrows, right? A negative relationship I'll symbolize with a red arrow. If there's the good relationship between me and you have a friend, right? I meet that person, there will be a pull inside of me that says, well, any friend of yours has to be a friend of mine, right? Any friend of a friend is my friend. Why? Because if you have somebody that you like, and I like you, we have a good relationship. If I tell you that I don't like the other person, it creates tension in our relationship. So in order to avoid the tension in our relationship, I have to like your friends. And this is what married couples go through as well. You know, I can't understand why you hang out with that guy. It's such a snob. Right? Because if that's your friend and this person is supposed to be my friend, if we are not, quote, differentiated enough to be able to say, you know what, I don't have to like everybody that you like. And you don't have to like everybody that I like. Okay? Well, what happens if you have instead an enemy? Same kind of thing. Right? If there's somebody that you don't like, I can't tell you that I like that person. And it could be a friend, it could be a sports team, right? You might be a fan of a particular team, but if your two teams are sworn enemies, there's going to be something inside of me that sort of resists letting you know that I actually root for the other team. So any enemy that you have must also be my enemy. Okay, so the enemy of a friend is my enemy. Those are the two ways in which the triangle becomes stable and balanced. Okay, I'm not saying that it's good, but at least it's stable in the sense that we get to avoid the tension that we might have with each other otherwise. Right? Now, if those are the two ways to balance a triangle, and you start thinking about how it is that one triangle leads to another triangle that leads to another triangle, and you see how this works in a larger system, then certain things begin to become clear. Okay? Let's make a system of 5 people. Okay, this is a really small church, but I promise you, if you actually do what I just showed you, and it doesn't matter how big the church is, you could draw out a map of all the possible relationships in the church, and it will still come out the same way. Right? You have the two ways of being able to balance the one triangle. How do you balance the whole system that's made up of many triangles? Okay? There's basically 3 ways to do that. All of the relationships between people could be positive. Right? We can all be friends. Now, you would hope that in most systems it would actually be true, that we really are friends here. And that's a good way of having a balanced relationship. But in some cases, it's not a true friendship. It's the kind of friendship that relies upon the fact that says there is some kind of an implicit rule that we're supposed to be friends. And so we need to act like it even if we're not. Okay? Here's a typical example of that. You are struggling to get your family to church in the morning. Now, somebody misplaced your car keys, you can't find your keys, you yell at your spouse, say, where are my keys? I don't have your stupid keys. Get the kids ready, their shoes aren't on, whatever it is, and you're continuing the argument in the car. Right? Kids are right in the back seat, you're continuing on in the front seat, and you get to church, and you open the doors of the car, and all of a sudden, it all stops. Right? You step out of the car, you're all smiles, brother, how are you? Right? Because you know that you can't do that at church. Pastors will tell you, if you live in a parsonage, for example, or you get phone calls from some church, you can have the family having an argument at home. They're yelling and they're screaming and they're carrying on, and the phone rings, and all of a sudden, everybody goes silent, and the pastor's wife picks up the phone and goes, hello. Right? Because nobody is supposed to know that there are actually conflicts that happen in the pastor's home. So sometimes it's true, everybody is friends, sometimes you have what one person might call a pseudo-mutual church, okay? Pseudo-mutual is a technical term that comes back in those days with the studies that were being done on schizophrenia that basically said in some families there is a rule, an implicit rule that says you may not express negativity towards each other. To express negativity is disloyalty. And so whatever it is that you're actually feeling, you have to keep things on an even keel. We love each other, right? Kid comes to the parent and says, I hate Daddy because he did this. Oh, no, sweetheart, you don't hate Daddy. Because it's not okay to hate Daddy, right, at the moment. And the kid's going to get over it in 5 minutes, but it's not okay to do that. That's one way to balance the system, okay? Another looks something like this. There's one subset of people, they're all friends with each other, they have all positive relationships with each other, but there is one person in the system that has a negative relationship with everyone, right? What would you call that? Exactly. We talked about the scapegoat before, right? And one of the reasons why the pastor might end up being the scapegoat is because this is the person that's connected with everyone in the system. Yeah? That a lot of the conflicts that happen in the church end up going through the pastor because the pastor is the one that gets triangled into everything. So sometimes this is what keeps a system balanced. Now, again, remember what the point of this is. Sometimes when you have one person in a church system who is made out to be the problem, and there may be some problematic behavior there, don't get me wrong, right? And sometimes there's unethical behavior and so on. But whenever you have somebody who is the problem, you might suspect the reason that that person is being labeled as the problem is because the rest of the group has a difficulty in how they deal with conflict. And having that person be the problem saved them from having to deal with other conflicts between themselves that they otherwise might have to face. That's the second way to balance the system. And the third one looks something like this, and there's different ways to draw it, okay? You have one group that's all friends with each other. You have another group that's all friends with each other, but all of the members of each group are enemies with the members of the other group. Okay? That looks familiar? This is one of the reasons why you might see a church actually split. And the reason that I want to bring that up is because when churches do split, sometimes what will be on the surface is all of the ideological issues as to why they're wrong and we're right. Their theology is wrong, the decisions that they make are wrong, and so on, right? But part of the emotional dynamic that underlies that split in the congregation may simply be we can't face the differences that we have with each other. It's easier for us to be able to say, we are the group that gets it right. You know the old joke that's saying, okay, you have your way, you do, go ahead and do things your way and I'll do it God's way. Right? It's too easy to be able to think of things in that way, instead of actually being able to listen to why it is that you've got other people who differ from you in the way that they think, or the things that they want to do, right? So what we have to ask ourselves is what the issue is. And when there's conflict in the church, what's really the issue? Because again, there's going to be some kind of a surface issue at play, oftentimes. And it could be that there are theological differences, they don't get it right, they don't understand who God is, they don't read the scripture correctly, and so on. Or sometimes it's even, what? You want to change to that translation of the Bible? That's not the real Bible. Or some such thing. It might be that there's moral outrage over something that's happened, and maybe rightly so. That somebody has done something that they shouldn't have done. But now there are going to be differences in terms of what you do about that, and how you're going to handle that. Maybe it's a matter of policy or procedure. People don't like change. And social systems don't like change. And there's going to be some pushback anytime somebody tries to change something, and maybe that's where the conflict lies. So all of that, what's the issue? There's going to be the surface issue, in terms of how people explain what's going on, but then there's also the process issue. When I work with couples, again, often I make this distinction between content and process. There is what you argue about, and there's how you argue. And the what ends up being the focus. You said this, I did not. Yes, you did. Okay? Oh, did I say that really? Yes. And if I had a tape recorder. Okay, nobody has tape recorders. If I had my iPhone out, at that point, I could have recorded it and I could play it back for you and show you you said that, right? It's not the content that's the problem, okay? Or at least that's not what sustains it. What sustains it is the way that they're having that argument. That's the process issue. You're never going to be able to prove who said what to whom. But you have two people who are being defensive and not listening to each other. And if you could get them to do that, you would probably get past whatever that argument is. So the question is not just what the content of the conflict is. The question is what's the process by which we deal with them. And at a social, emotional level, what is it that keeps a conflict going or sabotages our ability to resolve it? If you follow Bowen theory, some of it is going to be because we're unable to deal with conflict directly. We have a habit of bringing other people into it, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the probable direction of error is that it's going to keep it going. It's not going to resolve it. There are some problems that will go away on their own. That's fine, right? But there are some problems that won't. And if we keep doing this, if we keep involving more people and more people and more people, you know, when I triangle somebody else into a conflict, I'm not expecting or anticipating that they're going to triangle somebody else and they might. When I tell somebody, okay, you know, there's something going on over there, shh, don't tell anybody else. This is confidential information. I can trust you with a secret, right? I'm not anticipating they're going to tell somebody else, but they probably will. And on and on and on it goes. So where's the anxiety? Where's the tension? Where is it that there's a difference that's causing us to feel that kind of stress reaction? And how do we deal with it? Because how we deal with it is going to some extent, to predict how it's going to happen in the congregation, what kind of a conflict we might end up having. Okay? All right. So here's your discussion question. And we can take up until lunchtime to do this. And then when we come back this evening, we'll take some questions if there are any, right? Think about a disagreement that you may have experienced in a church context. Was it truly resolved? Did you actually feel that the matter got resolved, that you got some peace on that there was a mutual understanding? If so, how did you do it? And if not, why not? Well, what was it that kept it going, that kept it unresolved? How might the ideas of content versus process, in other words, what we argue about versus how we argue about it, and anxiety and triangling help you see the situation in. Is there anything in what I just said over the last couple of hours that can help you take another look at that situation and say, well, maybe this is the goal? Okay? Understand the question I'm asking you? I'll go ahead and break into groups, and then at noon we'll break for lunch and we'll come back and we'll have questions.